Also, the first event here for our third community open house, which is meant, as the last two have, to mark the anniversary of the arrival of the foundation in Lexington. Our building opened May 23rd, 1964. Was anyone here that day? There's always a few. It was, I remember, my memory is people say it was a nice, cool. Well, in any event, I'm glad you're here with us. Almost 60 years today after that. And this is our annual thank you to the community that we're so fortunate to call home. So after the lecture, lots of things going on upstairs. Melissa has pulled out some really cool stuff from the archives related to Patton and Patton's relationship with Marshall. And we have some refreshments and videos going, so please go up and enjoy yourself after the lecture. And this lecture, this year, will begin what we envision as a multi-year cycle at this event in May, focusing on not so much Marshall, but those with whom Marshall worked closely to make history. Today our subject is obviously this guy up on the screen, George Patton. But over the next several years, we'll feature similar events that feature Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, maybe even Joseph Stalin, and others as we use biography to discuss the most important moments of the 20th century. So you're our guinea pigs today to see how this goes. But we thought this was a neat way to kind of mark this event each year. Now, a couple of housekeeping items before the lecture. Once again, I'm delighted to thank Dominion Energy for its support of our Legacy Lecture Series. Dominion has long been and continues to be a great partner to the Mount Marshall Foundation, and we are very grateful to them for that. Now, our next set of events will be something new for us. Energy for its support of our Legacy Lecture Series. Dominion has long been and continues to be a great partner to the Mount Marshall Foundation. Melissa Davis, Glenn Carpenter, and I will take turns presenting a World War II film. So I will start on Saturday, June 1st with Saving Private Ryan. Glenn will present Stalag 17 on Thursday, July 18th. Maybe some of you remember that classic. And Melissa will finish things off on August 15th with The Imitation Game. So we'll provide some background information about each film before the screening and then end things with a bit of Q&A and discussion. The films will begin at 5:30 p.m. and we'll remind you of these dates again. Popcorn will be provided. Milk Duds, Twizzlers, and M&Ms, you're on your own. Now, we do require you to just register in advance just for some kind of legal reasons, but please do so. John Rannick has a sign-up sheet there, and he's waving it around. Say hi to John over there. That sign-up sheet will be down here after the lecture. We'll also have it upstairs. So even if you think you only want to attend one, just please sign up your name, and we will be good to go. So that is the last little bit of programming news. Now, also, if you have a cell phone with you, make sure it is silenced so we do not disturb our speaker. For those, actually, it's really embarrassing when the speaker's phone goes off. I say that not out of any personal, just as an observation. Now, for those of you joining us on YouTube TV, YouTube Live, you will be able to ask questions via the chat feature, which is at the bottom right of the video. Those questions we'll save for the end of the lecture. You can also email questions as we go along if that's more comfortable for you. librarian@marshallfoundation.org. Either way, it goes to Melissa in the back, and she will pass the questions along at the end. So now, for our speaker today. Furman Daniel holds a BA from the University of Chicago and a PhD from Georgetown. He is an associate professor of political science at Concordia University, Chicago. He's actually moving out there, he told me, in 3 weeks to take up his new job. So we're lucky to get him while he's still on the East Coast. Has previous teaching appointments at the National War College, Georgetown, George Washington University, and Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He's the author of dozens of publications on a wide range of subjects, including theory, the role of fiction in shaping foreign policy decision-making, Edmund Burke, Klaus von Clausewitz, George Patton, technology diffusion, and home field advantage in Major League Baseball. I think you might want to consider mixing it up a little bit. A little too narrow.
One trick pony.
Yeah. But his 3 books are 21st Century Patton, Strategic Insights for the Modern Era, The First Space War, How Patterns of History and Principles of STEM Will Shape Its Form, and Patton, Battling with History. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Daniel's diverse experiences include co-founding a hedge fund. I don't think we've ever had a speaker who could claim that. Focused on distressed commercial real estate. He's also served as an intelligence officer in the Navy Reserve. So please join me in a warm welcome to Furman Daniel.
Well, thank you very, very much. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And just a special set of thank you to Paul for inviting me here and making me feel very welcome, for Glenn running the sound and the AV for you both in the audience and online. And then just a special shout out to Melissa in the library upstairs. I am jealous of her. She has the best job in the world. She gets to handle Oscars and Nobel Prizes and documents. And if you have some time after the talk, please go up and see the exhibit she's worked really hard on. They're absolutely beautiful, and they can provide some extra detail to some of the things I'm going to talk about today and kind of really bring to life both Patton and General Marshall. So thank you to each and every one of you that brought me here and made this possible, but thank you also for those in the audience. I always like to start with if you don't get anything else out of this talk, make sure you get this, okay? So if you don't get anything else out of this talk, you can not pay attention in about 30 more seconds. If you don't get anything else out of this talk, it is that Patton is much more complex than the popular image would suggest. And I felt so strongly about that I didn't just write one book, trying to argue that. I had to write 2 books. And everywhere I go, people try to simplify Patton, or bring to me a Hollywood version of Patton, or the vision of Patton they want in their own head, right? A cowboy, a butt-kicking, soldier-slapping, gum-chewing, cursing person. Whatever they want to bring, they bring and they create this image. And sometimes that image is 100% true, but most of the time it isn't. And often when it isn't, it obscures a much more interesting truth about the man and about his time and about the history he made. Okay? So if you get nothing else, something like my dad would say, it's a little more complex than that. Okay? If you get nothing else, it's a little more complex than that. How I want to spend the time, so I've done dozens of talks on Patton and other things. I find that after about 30 minutes, I start losing my audience. So I'm going to do about 30 minutes of talking, about 25 on the books. Patton's more complex than you think. About 5 on Patton Marshall specifically, since I'm here. And then I want to share the rest of the time for questions and answer. If you have a question you absolutely have to ask, please, I'm not one of those people that can't be interrupted or anything like that, but I promise I will save as much time as possible for Q&A. And even after this event's over, if you want to come talk to me afterwards, I'm not going anywhere. So I want to spend about 30 minutes really hammering home the one simple thing, bless you, that Patton is more complex than you think, and it's dangerous and short-sighted to make him into something that doesn't quite match up. So to do a little bit of exercise, kind of class exercise, get the class involved, right? Take 20 seconds and think about what you think of when you think of George Patton. What does he look like? What does he sound like? Where is he? What's he doing? And if you're like the A+ super overachieving student, what made him good at his job? Okay? What does he look like? What does he sound like? Where is he? What's he doing? If you're totally trying to, be an overachiever, what made him great? Okay. So what does he look like? What does he sound like? Where is he? What's he doing? Well, it's obviously George C. Scott with a big gravelly voice standing in front of an American flag saying no bastard ever won a war for dying for his country and being this Hollywood image. Okay? There's a lot of truth to that and also a lot of falsehood. The biggest single factual inaccuracy of the entire Patton movie is actually his voice. His voice sounds, it's very hard to listen to, actually. It actually sounds like Mickey Mouse. It's high, it's nasally, it's squeaky. He kind of, much like the Mickey Mouse vocal pattern, which I'm not going to try to do, he'll interrupt himself like a breath in the middle. It's very, very, very hard to listen to. And George C. Scott, the great actor that he was, actually for the first couple days of filming, tried to mimic it, and it was so bad on film, and it was so hard to believe this famous, tough general had a Mickey Mouse voice that he just gave it up, and he used that gravelly George Scott voice, no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. Okay? Apparently, one other thing I learned in looking at the movie is that this scene where he's walking out from the flag absolutely scared people to death because it actually looked like he was walking into the audience. And particularly since this movie came out in the early 70s, if you had done drugs or were under the influence, apparently it was particularly difficult to watch this, and it actually gave people psychedelic freakouts, believe it or not, about this. If you want a wonderful thing about the movie, there's a book, Nick Sarentaki's book, Making Patton, an epic film's journey to the silver screen, which I highly recommend. Okay, and again, I'll answer any kind of questions you have that I can about the movies. But the point here is we have things in our head that your brain understands, and you build into your understanding of history and truth. Into what a political scientist, somebody trained like a political scientist me, would call your theory of the case. I think I understand the past based on this, and I'm going to apply that to the future based on this common understanding, right, to political science methodology for like 10 seconds. Your theory of the case is disproportionately biased by this wonderful but often wrong George C. Scott film. Okay? Again, the myth is really fun. The reality, I would actually challenge you, if you don't have time to read or buy the books, I'll give you the short list of some of the claims I make. What is less well known is this family connection, much of which happened here at VMI. Okay? George Patton had a very long military history in his family, going back to the Jacobite Rebellion in Scotland in the 1600s and 1700s. He was very proud of Confederate ancestry. He really thought of himself as continuing this legacy of his family. Okay, and very important and kind of brushed over in the film. He was a historian who read deeply. He went to battlefields and walked around and camped on the battlefields. He wrote articles. He was working on writing a book at the time of his death. He read and thought and wrote quite a bit about military subjects, military problems, military history, and it was a very big part of who he was and what made him successful. He was a thinker, right? It wasn't just enough to read. He thought about what the next step is. His war college thesis from 1932, if you read it, and it's actually reproduced in 21st Century Patton book, it basically predicts a world war in Europe, and it talks about Germany's advantages, how they have a central position, how they use the Reichswehr as a cadre to build out a larger Treaty of Versailles military, how motorization will make conflict faster, and this will necessitate all these kind of changes to command and control and things like that. He figures that out in 1932 as a war student. Again, because he's thinking about these problems. He's working very deeply trying to anticipate the next. He was not this kind of psychic, like we would have you say. He was not this natural warrior. He was actually a thinker, right? And that actually is very different than the movie would suggest. He was also a tinkerer. He loved playing with automobiles, cars, tanks. He was an early aviation pioneer, so he worked on planes that he would then get in and fly. He loved taking the things apart and working with them, right? And again, figuring out how things worked. Taking a tank apart with his friend General Eisenhower in 1920 when they were at Camp Meade, taking the tank apart, putting it back together again, so that if you were a tank commander, you could actually step in and fix a tank. Or you could figure out what are the parts on a tank that are most likely to break, or what are key problems with refueling a tank in the field and doing it quickly. Getting a treasure backpack. Taking it apart and putting it back together again is a wonderful way to figure that out. He wasn't a natural warrior. He took time to take it apart and put it back together again. Okay? He traveled. He loved travel, both in the United States and overseas. Travel was a big part of kind of how he thought about the world. He would visit churches. He would visit art museums. He would visit battlefields. He would visit monasteries, all kinds of things that made him better understand the literal terrain that he might find someday, but also kind of the human terrain and the human culture that he would have to interact with. He was a reader. He had a very large private library of over 1,000 books. He read and underlined and reread. He was very much a reader in a way that is not really talked about in the movie or not baked into our popular conception of it. He loved taking photography. He was an amateur photographer. Many of the pictures of him from World War II, he has his own personal camera around his neck. He loved taking pictures. Many of them are still available in the Library of Congress's photo collection and with Patton's own writing on them. There's also a wonderful book that reproduces a lot of them called War as He Saw It, that reproduces a lot of his pictures, and he has very interesting, some of them are just, 5 dead Germans or bridge that I crossed. Some of them are kind of boring, but he has some of them are actually, very detailed descriptions of this was the key hill we took as part of our drive across Europe or as part of this battle. Very, very interesting, and he took pictures partly because he liked taking pictures and developing them in a dark room and things like that, but also because he thought they could help him be a more successful soldier. He was a pilot. In the 1930s, he got his private pilot's license. Apparently, he was a very aggressive pilot, and people didn't like to actually ride with him while he was flying. And he was particularly dangerous, apparently, landing. He liked to land really fast and kind of pop the plane down as quickly as possible. But he liked being a pilot, and he thought that being able to fly a small aircraft will allow him to do recon of his own or to do liaison trips in between frontline units of his own. During World War II, he didn't really fly on his own private, or he had military pilots to fly him around. But this was something that he took very seriously, he enjoyed doing, and again, he baked into his understanding of leadership. He was an art critic. He loved art. Right? He was very into art, particularly oil paintings and stained glass windows. And his diaries and letters and things have dozens of sketches of various paintings and stained glass art. He talks about it in his letters. He visited art museums as part of his travel. Again, the softer side of George Patton, right? And something you wouldn't normally think of. Tough, butt-kicking, soldier-slapping soldier, caring about Impressionist paintings, or Corot, or some of these other folks. He particularly liked Corot. He was also an Olympic athlete. He was a world-class athlete. He was in the modern pentathlon. I'll talk about that a little more. But again, physical presence and the ability to, even though you're tired and frustrated and have been working for 48 hours straight, you can have the physical gumption, physical presence to keep pushing through the fact that you're tired and stressed out. Caught up to him in Sicily when he slapped some soldiers, but one of his biggest things was his ability to, when he was tired, when he was faced with physically demanding things, he was able to overcome because he was strong. Really quick, the 30-second version on my 2 books so that you don't have to buy a lot. Patton's more complex than you think, right? The 21st Century Patton is a reproduction of a bunch of the articles he wrote during the 19 teens and 20s and 30s, talking about future war. So Patton's more complex than his popular image thinks. His skills as a writer and a historian are actually every bit as important as his skills as a soldier, and that his writings give us insight to this. If you want to read the originals, reproductions of the originals rather, I've collected a bunch of them and written little short essays. Hey, this is where he was during this period. This is what he was writing about. This is how he used it in his career. Okay. Second book, similar, right? Patton's more complex than you think, and that matters for our understanding of World War II and our understanding of history. Basically, it's about Patton's use of history. Right? To go back a couple slides, he really cared about learning and thinking and anticipating different kind of challenges on the battlefield. One of his ways of doing that is reading and writing and thinking about history so that he could apply it and make it. He also, in one of the last chapters, the one that people that really wanted to defend Patton really give me a hard time about, he also was not above manipulating history in a self-serving way. He falsified the historical record on multiple things in a very unflattering way. Right? Why did he do that? Because he cared about history, and he cared about his place in it, and he wanted to edit out of history by writing history, edit out of history the things that weren't so flattering. Okay. Finally, and this is kind of the workology kind of thing, Patton achieved Clausewitzian coup d'oil. Right? Clausewitz talks about how in the flash of an eye, a good general unfolding battlefield and make in just that flash of an eye, that a couple of seconds of looking at it and understanding, they can see an unfolding battle and anticipate and act on what they see. That inward eye, that kind of mark of military genius, that in that flash of an eye you can see what we went on. Napoleon had it, Drake had it, Patton had it, is what I claim. And he has that because he studied and thought and worked on it his entire life. It was not an accident. It was not like the movie would suggest that he was a reincarnated soul of somebody. He actually worked really, really hard to develop the natural gifts that he was born with. All right, just a couple of kind of stories to bring out this. Patton's a lot more complex and interesting than you might think. This is Patton's honeymoon picture. He was married in Boston to his sweetheart, Beatrice Eyre. They were absolutely a wonderful match for each other. It also helped that her family was incredibly wealthy. Her dad, Frederick Eyre, was one of the wealthiest people in America. He sold patent medicines like cough syrup, hair tonics, and things like that. Didn't really do a lot of good, including Patton used some to try to fix his receding hairline. It didn't do any good. But her dad was worth tens of millions of dollars in the early 1900s off selling these cough kind of phony cures. They get married, and he takes leave from the army to go on a honeymoon. He goes at first to the United Kingdom, but his honeymoon is actually cut short. They had planned to go to France as his honeymoon. Honeymoon's cut short, but he kind of gets this taste of European travel for the first time. A couple of years later, he goes to two different summers. One's in 1912, after the 1912 Olympics, which he's a pentathlete in, and then the next summer in 1913, he goes to the French Cavalry School in Semblance, France. Okay, he considered it the second and third trips to Europe, the two trips to France in 1912 and 1913. The completion of his honeymoon plan. So if you see honeymoons, I was a grad student. Again, when you talk about, well, what made him different? What made him successful? On his trips to France, he interviewed veterans from the Franco-Prussian War. He studied battlefields, right? He looked at harbors and made notes about harbors in the English Channel. What harbors can we bring over supplies in? Now, this is a 20-something-year-old person on his honeymoon making studies of harbors in the English Channel. I don't know what you did on your honeymoon. I didn't look at harbors, right? The most interesting thing that he does on his honeymoon is in the second and third trip to Europe, the two trips to France, he makes a very detailed sketch of the Normandy road networks on his own initiative. About a 50-page study of the secondary roads and the main roads in the kind of Normandy region of France. Okay, and this is in 1912 and 1913. He said, I'm going to fight a battle here someday, or somebody will. He files this when he gets back to Fort Leavenworth from his honeymoons, files it with the Army, and the Army does what the Army does, put it in a cabinet and don't look at it, because it's Melissa to bring it out and bring it to life. Okay? They put it in a file cabinet, don't look at it, until Patton is tasked with doing a breakout from Normandy. And one of the problems they keep having with is it rains a lot in it, and the roads aren't very good, so they get muddy, especially when military vehicles go over them again and again and again and again and again. They need a survey of the road network, and then estimates on how quickly the road network will dry out after it rains. And the best report they have is the one Patton wrote on his honeymoon and filed at Fort Leavenworth and has been forgotten. So he's planning the Cobra breakout and says, I did this, and I filed it in 1913, go find it in the Leavenworth Library and send it back to me. So they find it in the Leavenworth Library, they send it back to him, and he has a really good, in his own hand, in his own writing style, map of the road networks. And the rest, as they say, is history. Right? One of my favorite things is, like I mentioned, he was a pentathlete. He was in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. He finished fifth, which is pretty amazing. He would have finished better if he had actually shot better with the pistol, which should have been his best event, but he insisted on using his Army service pistol rather than a specially customized target pistol. And so he claimed, and this is an early example that probably falsifying the historical record, he claims he put a bullet on the paper target. Probably not. Probably actually missed the target because he'd been out partying the night before with a bunch of Swedish diplomats and fancy pants. Okay, but he still finishes fifth, and he makes a reputation for himself actually as a swordsman. One of the pentathletes events was fencing. This is actually him. That's him on the right of that picture in the 1912 Olympics. Okay, he basically neglected defense. He was not a particularly well-trained swordsman. He neglected defense. He attacked. He was very aggressive with his swordsmanship, but it actually won attention of professional fencers. And it won attention of the Army, who was needing to redo their sword manual and kind of relearn swordsmanship in the early 1900s. So they actually sent him to the French school at Samar. He studied very detailed under the world's greatest Claret, and becomes the military expert, the U.S. expert on sword making, on swordsmanship, on fencing, and actually on his own initiative, again, goes and tells the Army that their saber's wrong. Right? If you've seen a Civil War cavalry saber, that Model 18, I think 448, and there's also an 1860 model saber, they're standard cavalry saber, very heavy blade, very heavily curved, big hand guard, good for slashing people on horseback, good for looking at ice. Patton realized that guy wasn't very good for killing people and breaking things. He redesigns the sword with a shorter, straighter blade for stabbing him. And he says this is not only borne out by how fencing is taught, but it's borne out by a couple thousand years of history. So he writes, and again, it's reproduced in 21st Century Patton, he writes a series of articles about swordsmanship and talks about how, if you want a killing blow, the edge is not the weapon. Or the edge of the weapon is not the place to kill somebody. You stick them on the point and drive it into their soft parts and actually kill them. Okay? And he said, we need to do this. So he goes and designs one. And to this day, the cavalry saber, not that we use the cavalry saber much anymore, but the cavalry saber that's still the kind of current model U.S. cavalry saber is this sword, which is commonly known as the Patton. Okay, but again, very kind of, some would say obnoxious, some would say enterprising. I would say enterprising and obnoxious. Junior officer saying, hey, I know a couple hundred years of armor tradition. And I'm going to do the thing that they always tell you, if you're an officer, don't just say there's a problem, fix it. Exactly. Propose a solution and fix it. And it does. And to get the Army on board, he writes all these articles about the history of swordsmanship. Right? Again, an early example of changing the Army, an early example of not kind of keeping his mouth shut and upsetting some people, but also an early example of using history to get his way. I got to go quick because I want to save time for Q&A. He also uses history in his kind of first action in Mexico. He talks with local cowboys, and he talked to the boy of the Confederate partisan leader, John Singleton Mosby, about horseback tactics, hit and run cavalry tactics, about how to use repeated rifles to kind of do ambush tactics. He talks a lot with the local cowboys to kind of get an intelligence network on the Mexican banditos that have been coming over the border. And when he gets into a gun battle, he uses these old-fashioned kind of guerrilla tactics that he learns from the cowboys and he learned from the Confederate raiders. He also marries that up with something thoroughly modern, which is Dodge Company touring cars, right? He says, well, we can use automobiles out in the desert. They're faster. They don't need water like a horse does. And they have a little bit of protection in the way a horse doesn't. We can sneak up on key Mexican banditos' headquarters, approach from all sides, use the tactics that were perfected by the cowboys and the Confederate raiders, use the new technology of cars, and kind of have the best of both worlds. So the first mechanized assault in American history was during the punitive expedition in Mexico in 1916. Patton uses Dodge cars to surprise this guy, Julio Cardenas, who was a top lieutenant of the Mexican leader. Okay, captures him, brings him back, and wins one of his first countries and first taste of action. Okay, becomes this national celebrity, a good news story, and an otherwise kind of frustrating, not very good campaign, the punitive expedition 1916, 1917 in Mexico. He then uses this expertise, right? So during World War I, he's bored. He's actually staff member for Pershing, and he's censoring mail and showing people around Pershing's headquarters. Is actually where he first meets General Marshall, is he's showing some generals around, and Marshall is attached to the Big Red 1 division commander's staff. They meet, and they're basically showing their bosses around. He's bored censoring mail for General Pershing. So he takes a risk. He says they started asking for volunteers to serve in the tank corps. He writes this paper. He said, well, I've been working on automobiles for over 10 years. I've led the first mechanized attack in history, and nobody's better than me to do this. So he does. He's actually the second tank officer in the American Tank Corps. He figures out a lot of the problems. Again, I mentioned he's a tinkerer. He likes taking things apart and putting them back together. He actually goes for a week to the French Renault tank factory and actually works on the assembly line, putting tanks together. Figures out two different things. He says you've designed your firewall to keep the engine heat away from the driver. You can easily redo that. And your ignition system, your starter harness, can be redone where it's more reliable. Okay, French cars not always known for the reliability. He was fifth even then. So he figured out problems again because he's mechanically inclined. Because he was lucky enough to have cars in the early 1900s when cars were really expensive. They were kind of for the rich. Okay, he had a rich wife, it helped. But he was able to figure this out. He was able to kind of work with British and French tank experts to actually bring the American Tank Corps up to speed very, very quickly. He actually leaves the Tank Corps in 1920. The US Congress starts funding it after the war, but not before running into one of his longtime friends, General Eisenhower at Camp Meade. They actually took, like I mentioned before, they took the one tank that was there, and yes, only one tank. They took it apart and put it back together to prove they could do it. They also brewed bathhouse gin. It was during Prohibition. Gin, and ironically actually raided, or tried to raid, rum runners themselves. They dressed up as police officers and tried to sneak up on rum running, distillers out in the Maryland countryside. It's probably a good thing they never caught anybody, because then they would have gotten in a bizarro kind of thing. But anyway, history and tinkering and thinking, working hard, come together. This wasn't an accident. This was something we worked very, very, very hard on. My favorite chapter of the Patton history chapter is the North Africa chapter. There are so many things about him. Okay, the campaign, North Africa campaign was really a shoestring campaign. Okay, for political reasons, FDR wanted to get the American army in the Normandy. They wanted to show support for the British, and Patton came all the way from Normandy to hit the beach in Morocco, and was bored on the ship. He at the first couple days, he was nervous. He was checking everything that was packed right. He was going over the op plan. And a couple days after doing that, yep, the op plan's still good. Stuff still packed right. Op plan's still good. Stuff still packed right. He gets bored. So he's like, well, what do I do? I'm on the ship. I don't have anything to do. He starts reading the Quran. On his own. Nobody's telling him to do this. He said, oh, I'm about to go into an area that's Muslim population, that's had a history of revolt, and I'm running this operation there. I better understand the history, culture, and religion of the people I'm going to interact with. So he reads the Quran cover to cover, makes notes about it, and actually quotes it in some of his meetings with the Arab authorities in North Africa. Right? An amazingly kind of forward-looking thing, an amazingly open-minded thing, okay? He also kind of figures out, they didn't really call it counterinsurgency at the time, but he figures out, hey, you need to keep the local population, the Arab population, happy because you don't want to fight them. You want to keep the French authority involved, right? The Vichy French, once they flip, you need to keep them involved so they can actually run your gendarme, run your police force, right? And you need to kind of message this in a way where you stay ahead of the narrative. Put time back on the clock, kind of quote John Nagel and then counterinsurgency stuff. He figures out counterinsurgency thing again, not because there's a doctrine on it, not because the United States military has a long kind of history of teaching that. He figures it out because of his studies of different wars, the campaign in the Philippines, some of the failures of the campaigns that he witnessed in Mexico. You got to keep the population, and you need a security force that's local, right? So when they knock out the Vichy French, what does he do? He drinks champagne with them, and in 12 hours of the French surrendering, they are part of the occupation force policing the streets of North Africa. Okay. He uses his French language, he uses his ability to kind of be proactive and get ahead of the problem. Okay. General Eisenhower says the incorporation of the pacification of the Muslim population didn't revolt. And the Nazis were actually trying very ham-handedly, but they were trying very hard to actually get the Muslim populations to revolt against the United States by feeding them really nasty propaganda, including one unbelievable thing that Roosevelt was a Jew and that they would kind of North Africa, a Jewish colony of America. The Patton was able to kind of speak to this. I've read the we are not be occupiers. We are not kind of trying to make Christianity or Judaism plan. We're trying to beat the Nazis, guys. Help us do that so then you can beat the French later. Okay? He pacifies the Arab population. He gets the French on board. He keeps a revolt from happening. And Dwight Eisenhower said that just doing that saved 500,000 Americans from having to do peace and pacification duties behind the lines in North Africa. 500,000, 500,000 American soldiers are free to go beat the Italians and the Germans where it's actually more important. Okay? So how does he beat the French and Germans? Once he kind of takes over after Friedenthal's kind of failures at Kasserine, he starts using history as an analogy to plan that campaign. And he goes back to the American Civil War and says, and you know, one of the things the movie gets right, it's kind of a small little quote that he uses at least twice in the movie, hold on to him by the nose and kick him in the ass. Right? Sorry for the bad language. Hold on to them by the nose and kick them in the ass. Have a force to hold the enemy down when they attack, and then a flanking force to hit them in the side, cut off their avenue of escape, hit them from the side, make them panic, make them scatter, win them. Okay? He says the best example he can think of about that in history is the Battle of Second Manassas. Okay? General Pope basically attacks Jackson thinking he has them outnumbered. Jackson holds for just long enough for Longstreet's detour to come up from Northern Virginia, attack him in the flank. The holding force that grabs him by the nose, the flanking force that kicks him in the ass, to use Patton's terminology. He conceptualizes this and sells it to his division level commanders by saying, hey, you remember your time at West Point or VMI where you learned about this? We're going to do it to the Germans. And they did. The Battle of El Guitar used a holding force, pin them down, use a flanking force, and also the kind of new technology of air power to attrit their kind of ability to retreat from there. Okay? Again, I cannot say it enough. It's more complex, but also more interesting. Right? I'm going to read the Quran. I'm going to know the French language and French culture because I've traveled in France and learned French language at West Point. I'm going to know Civil War history, and I'm also going to be that ass-kicking soldier at the same time. Okay. I'll talk very briefly. Patton was, like I said, we're not above lying. He was not above changing his place in history. Real quick, bunch of things he falsified, but the one that I think is the worst is toward the end of World War II in Europe, he sent a small task force out to rescue his son-in-law, John Waters. John Waters is a gentleman in the hospital bed here, was a lieutenant colonel, very brave person, ended up making full general in the army in the 1960s, but was captured very early on in North Africa. Captured in some of the follow-up to the disaster at Castres Pass. Patton loved his son-in-law dearly, and it kind of became an obsession. How do we save John Waters? I want to get my son-in-law back. Very understandable. I get it. My daughter's only 4, so I don't have a son-in-law. It'll be a while. But I get it. You stand up for your family. Loyalty matters. Family matters. It mattered to Patton. It mattered so much, though, that it got him. He actually sent a small force known as Task Force Bomb out to kind of raid this German prisoner of war camp in Hammelburg, Germany, where he had gotten an intelligence report that John Waters was being captured. Basically, he sent a small and underarmed detachment out on a rescue mission for a personal reason. He didn't properly kind of plan this operation. He didn't properly resource this operation. And when the Germans actually had a lot more forces in that area than he thought they did and captured Task Force Bomb, he then denied that this was about trying to free his son-in-law. He denied that it was a poorly planned kind of last-minute thing. He denied any kind of responsibility whatsoever. Okay? He rewrote when he does for his memoir, Wars I Knew, it was published, but the description of this raid in there is incredibly self-serving. Basically is, well, you know, this mistake happened, but I didn't have anything to do with it. No, he had things to do with it, and as I spent a lot of time talking about, he ordered it. He had there's smoking gun evidence in the documentary record about him, hey, look for John Waters when you're at this. Right? That is not you didn't know about it. That's you knew about it and asked specifically to try to rescue your son-in-law. Okay? But again, he cared about his place in history. And he was not above lying. As much as he loved history, as much as he used history, he was not above kind of rewriting it. Also, towards the end of his career, his last assignment was the commander of the 15th Army, which was to write the lessons learned of the war in Europe, and actually does a fantastic job as a historian. He gets the 15th Army, he gets fired from his job as military proconsul of Bavaria because he kind of did a mixed job at that. But he actually does a fantastic job writing lessons learned for the Army after the war's over. Okay, and is killed in a traffic accident. I'll just say it now, although I almost always get a question about it. There's absolutely no evidence that there was a murder conspiracy to try to kill George Patton or to silence George Patton or anything like that. Okay, real quick, since we're at the very beautiful Marshall Center, I think Patton's relationship with Marshall fits in well with this. It's more complex and it's more interesting than you might think. It's very tempting as a historian or as a biographer to kind of create
this guy was like this, or this person was like this, and this person was like that, right? Kind of yin and yang. I guess my English teacher would call it a dramatic foil or dynamic foil. I think that's what my English teacher would call it. She'll be very disappointed. I'm sorry, Miss Ridenauer, if you're out there on the internet listening. But this kind of contrast, the good guy, the bad guy, or the stoic professional warrior like Marshall versus the reincarnated psychic, badass bad boy like George Patton. I think the truth on both of those is actually much more interesting than the Patton was all about go and Marshall was all about kind of management and being a good soldier, right? I think it's much more interesting. So like I mentioned, they first met in the summer of 1917 when Patton was sensory male for General Pershing. They both made short notes about it in their diaries, and they kept crossing paths during World War I. Okay, and again, very high opinion of each other as kind of mid-ranking officers during World War I. They crossed paths again briefly at Camp Meade in 1920, and then go 19 years without seeing each other. They wrote occasionally during the interwar period, but just as the Army kind of assignment system was, they didn't actually see each other for quite a while. They wrote each other, they knew of each other, they read each other's memos and papers, but they didn't have this kind of physical connection. They reconnect in the summer of 1939 when Marshall is serving as the Chief of Staff of the Army. His quarters at Fort Myer are being redone, and Patton says, "Hey, you can stay with me." Marshall takes him up on it, and they renew their friendship. They renew their kind of mutual respect for each other. They go out riding with each other. They go out shooting with each other. Marshall's a very famous horseman. Patton was also a very accomplished rider as well. They went on long rides with each other. They talked about military problems, and they spent a lot of what they did was not recorded, but it's generally believed they were kind of saying, "Hey, it's 1939. It looks like war is going to happen sooner rather than later. It looks like we have some really serious military challenges ahead of us. Let's start thinking. And let's, work and kind of rekindle this friendship and rekindle this working relationship." Marshall was, I'm sure many of you know better than I, a fantastic mentor for countless military officers during this period. He was a mentor for George Patton, right? And again, if you take this, Patton just got it or was natural or didn't need help or was his own kind of free agent, you miss this mentorship piece. You miss the fact that he had people that cared about him and watched his career from afar and helped him out. And Marshall did all of those things. Marshall had, his famous eye for talent. Melissa was showing me some documents where they're actually looking at some of the memo to Marshall from Leslie Mary about kind of scoring the Louisiana maneuvers. Right? Marshall saw that and acted on it and mentored Patton, brought him in. Okay. And then Patton was actually much more politically savvy than people give him credit for. One of the people he cultivated was George Marshall, because he was then Chief of Staff of the Army. Okay. Patton was also very lucky that Marshall became Chief of Staff of the Army and not his rival Hugh Drum. Hugh Drum and Patton were like vinegar or were like water and oil. They just did not mix. They had feuded off and on for decades. They had actually cursed at each other on the polo fields in Hawaii when they were both serving at Schofield Barracks. They just did not like each other. Patton did not respect Drum. Drum thought Patton was a loose cannon, was a liability, was a jerk, or worse. Just did not like each other. Drum briefly, when he's being considered for Chief of Staff of the Army, actually writes Patton a letter and says, "Hey, I'm willing to stop feuding if you'll help me out, help me get a Chief of Staff job." I have not seen a response to that. If it exists, Patton, if it exists, I don't know. But Drum's like, "Hey, can you help me out? I'll stop being a jerk to you." Kind of odd, right? Marshall becoming Chief of Staff of the Army and not Drum is really, really good for Patton. I truly believe Drum would have short-circuited Patton's career over personal petty jealousy. Okay. I think Marshall also was, to kind of go into this mentorship and this eye for talent and this kind of fantastic manager of a very complex organization like the United States Army, he probably understood Patton's strengths. He understood that he was somebody that could get something done quickly. He understood that he was an excellent person to train young men and to go into battle. His first kind of assignment after the war starts is to actually create the Desert Training Center on the California-Arizona border. And Patton goes out and does that. It's fantastic kind of training ground to do practice desert warfare. Marshall realizes that Patton grew up in Los Angeles, so knows that area, had a private plane so he could go scout the area, and was a guy that would make training realistic and hard, so that army that was being formed out there in the desert could actually fight a different desert against the Africa Corps. Marshall did it and put Patton on it, and Patton delivered. He also realized Patton was not always the type of person that had his mouth shut, not always the type of person that could be fully trusted. And Marshall put this in right, that Patton's strengths were not, as a kind of a politician. So when it came to using Patton during World War II, Marshall was an American first, was a patriot first. And despite the fact he was friends with Patton, despite he had an enormous respect for Patton's ability as a general officer, as a combatant man, he did put a ceiling on Patton's career. He chose Omar Bradley for Overlord over Patton. Right? Even though Patton was more senior, even though Patton was more famous, even though Patton in many ways was a better, kind of operational and tactical level combatant commander. He realized Bradley was more politically savvy. He realized Bradley had a better relationship with the United States Navy, which you need to get to the beaches in Normandy and keep the supplies going. He realized Bradley had a better relationship with the He correctly, I think, and I'm a Patton fan, he correctly picked Bradley over Patton for Overlord. Okay? He also saves Patton. There's always this kind of who saved Patton or kind of why. The fact of the matter is, because Marshall understood Patton was a fantastic combat commander, they saved him for that. And then they overlooked his slapping incidents, and they overlooked his misstatements to the British ladies at the Knutsford Dugout Club. That became this international incident that's depicted in the movie. They overlooked that, but they realized they only overlooked it so far, and they kind of were very kind of careful to put Miles Patton behind the scenes and say, "This is your last chance. Don't screw up, but we're going to use you for the battles that are going to come." Melissa has some fantastic documentation upstairs if you want to look at the actual cables on this. They're really, really fascinating. But they made a tough choice. This is a political embarrassment. This is a liability. This is a hard choice, but we need to keep Overlord strong. We need to keep kind of our best command in our kind of quiver of arrows, if you will. Okay, I believe that's actually the term Marshall used. Keep them in your quiver. Okay. They did that. They saved Patton so that he could do wonderful things like the Stone, like the Normandy breakout. Okay, they got it. Marshall, though, again, was an American first, was a patriot first, and understood that as the war in Europe was finishing, Patton desperately wanted to get in the Pacific, but understood that there were politics involved, and understood that Patton might not be the best person for that. So he refused to pull strings for Patton to get in the Pacific. He said the only kind of hope for Patton getting a command in the Pacific is if China was able to kind of make some advances to open up additional ports to get supplies in, and there would still probably be a second-tier command based in China for Patton. Okay, but he refused to kind of get his friend a command, even though Patton desperately wanted one. He also refused. Patton said, "Well, if I can't go get a combat command, I'd love to be commandant of West Point, or I'd love to be the head of the Army War College." And again, Marshall said, well, technically those are 2-star star. I'm not going to, put you in a billet that is not suited for you and that's actually suited for somebody else. Even though Patton had been, I think, a pretty good West Point commandant or a pretty good Army War College commandant. He refused to pull that string. He refused to break the rule for his friends. And I think it speaks to the type of man, the type of soldier that Marshall really was. Okay? I've talked way longer than I planned. I'm sorry. But what are your questions? By the way, and if you forget, that is my personal email. So send me an email if you forget something or think about it later. That's me doing stuff all around the world. Question? Yes, sir.
What do you know about Patton's health toward the end of the war? He apparently died of congestive heart failure. In addition to the injuries he sustained, he was only 60 years old, I read.
So the technical cause of death is a pulmonary embolism. After his car accident, he was on his back, immobile for several weeks. He had spine trauma, and his health went down very, very quickly. But his health towards the end was very good. He complains about things. He had a tooth that was a replacement tooth that kept falling out the last couple months of his life. He complained after the war was over and he was working a reduced schedule and going to all these dinners. He gained about 15 pounds of weight because he was going, he was getting wined and dined and not pushing himself, working 18-hour days. But by and large, his health was fantastic. It really until the last month or so of his life because of eating, and then the last couple of weeks of his life because of the car wreck. But his health was good, as far as I can tell. I mean, some people have claimed that he had hardening of the arteries in his brain. Some say he had lingering effects of being kicked in the head by a horse in the 1930s that might have affected his judgment. I think that's a really dangerous road to go down because I'm not a medical expert. Most people making these claims are not medical experts, and we don't have the actual patient to look at. But from everything I can tell, Patton thought his health was in good shape, other than the two, other than gaining about 10, 15 pounds towards the end. But the car wreck was really a very severe. Yes, sir.
Could you speak to Patton's time here at VMI? He was here for a year, I understand. And then why he didn't get into West Point, and was that VMI, his time spent here, was it any connection? Was that something that brought him and Marshall together?
So there's a couple different questions. So why did he come here? He came here because he went to he had read even schooling as a kid in the suburb of Los Angeles. He was in and out of a couple different schools, most of which weren't very good, so that he couldn't do well on some of the entrance exams. Academically, he just wasn't hard. His father also angered some of the political folks needed for an appointment to West Point. So kind of a not very good school. And his father's own political career messing up some of his political prospects for an appointment. He couldn't get one straight away. There was a definite family connection to VMI. So I hear, well, because he was a third generation VMI cadet. And the tailor at VMI was the same tailor that had measured his father and one of his uncles, and he had the exact same measurements VMI cadet uniform as both of them did. While he was here, he also, one of his uncles, William Tazewell Patton, was actually reinterred, was killed in the Civil War. They reinterred his body. So he actually attended his funeral, and at the funeral, part of the coffin breaks off, and his dead uncle rolls out of the and he actually sees him and is really happy that he sees him. I see my uncle. He also looked very favorably at the time in terms of military discipline. They were much tougher than West Point in terms of kind of inspections and things like that. One of the things that was famous at the time is they would make people brace, stand up very straight. He talked about how they braced harder at VMI than they did at West Point, that they did for inspections, and that his rap at VMI was harder than his two plebe years and two plebe years at West Point. Why did he leave? Well, at the time, VMI did not guarantee appointments as an officer. I'm sorry, they did not guarantee commissions in the military. Marshall was actually the only person out of his graduating age to get a active duty commission out of VMI at the time. So he left to go to West Point because he had a much better chance for him getting an active duty commission. And then what did Marshall and Patton, did they bond over the VMI connection? Yes, but not as much as you might think. Marshall apparently, and there's certainly people here that know better than I, had kind of a mixed time at VMI. Almost died after a wound in the buttocks from a bayonet. And I think Marshall had a somewhat mixed view of his time at VMI, and I think Patton kind of did too. But they both did talk about that. Apparently, it was one of the first things they mentioned in 1917 when they met in Pershing's headquarters. But does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Patton dyslexic?
I'll give you the same answer I gave about the hell wall. I think it's very dangerous when you're not a medical expert to make a medical judgment about someone you've never seen and has been dead 80 years. Having said that, I think the answer is no. I think he read too much, wrote too much to kind of have your standard kind of dyslexic problems. His spelling was bad, but at the time, in the early 1900s, there was not standardized spelling like there is in the United States today. Dictionaries were kind of just kind of a standard thing. So standardized spelling was not common. So to say his spelling is not a smoking gun on the dyslexia thing. He struggled at school. When he got to West Point, he actually had to repeat his plebe year because of deficiencies in mathematics. He also had bad grades in French and several of the science classes. But I think that's as much to do with the fact that he didn't like those subjects, and apparently the schools he went to out in California. I think it's pretty mixed. People say he hated spelling and he struggled at West Point. I think he struggled at West Point because he didn't have good schooling, and in the subjects he liked, like English and history, he did great. He wrote really well. He read a lot. So I think it's overdone that he had dyslexia, and there was no such thing as standardized spelling. Yes, sir, and then I'll get you next.
What, if any, is the relationship between Fox and Patton? And two, how severe was Patton's roadway?
It's a great question. So Fox Connor is the man that made Eisenhower. Was the person that when I mentioned Patton going in the tank car because he was bored. Patton had actually had a liver condition. Some people call it jaundice. It may or may not have been jaundice. For drinking while being bored on Pershing's staff. He was actually recovering from the jaundice in a hospital, runs into Fox Connor and I start talking about the tank corps, and credits Fox Connor for encouraging him to take a chance and apply for these billets in the tank corps. So if that's true, and Patton certainly said it was true, then Fox Connor was kind of the man not only that made Eisenhower, but at least gave Patton a strong push in a direction that would later define him. The second question was what?
The severity of World War I.
Oh, life-threatening. So he would have almost certainly died if one of his personal assistants, a guy by the name of Sergeant Joe Angelo, hadn't have come and put a bandage on him. And even then, he lost some amount of blood and spent about a month in the hospital recovering. So a very large wound. He had turned around to see his true and was actually shot in the buttocks. So he would often make rather crude jokes that I won't repeat here about how his kind of lasting medal, his lasting experience from World War I was a wound in the rear. But no, life-threatening, and if Joe Angelo hadn't have patched it up, he would have died. Interesting thing about Joe Angelo, he then Angelo was then after the war as a bonus marcher, and kicks Joe Angelo out of D.C. as part of his, he was deputy to Eisenhower, or not Eisenhower, deputy to, I can't talk today, deputy to MacArthur. MacArthur picking the and Joe Angelo and Patton actually cross paths, and Patton there's different versions of this, either pretends not to notice him, even when Joe Angelo remember me, or some say he actively targets him because he's angry that his former assistant is there. So very life-threatening and kind of an interesting story to that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that he was not above lying and manipulating. What does his personal life indicate about his character? Was he also a scoundrel at times in his personal life?
Yes. So he almost certainly had a extramarital affair off and on with his husband. I'm sorry, not his cousin, with his niece, which is, so it probably started when she was in Hawaii in the 1930s, when he was at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. She was about 20 years old at the time, and Beatrice Patton actually threatened to leave him multiple times, and actually, as part of her revenge, wrote this novel called Shark, which is a novel about husbands and strong female characters standing up their husbands. Niece and him cross paths again during World War II, and quite possibly kind of restarted their extramarital affair there. Your niece is probably, as a historian, you're trying to be objective. It's hard to be objective on that. So that's just one example. Stretching the imagination.
Did his subordinates in the military trust him? Were they leery of him?
So Patton had an interesting habit of picking staffers that oftentimes other people didn't. And this, giving them a second chance, or picking people that had family connections, like Lieutenant Colonel Codman, kind of one of the spoilers in the movie. Family connections going back to Boston, was a Boston wine merchant and a World War I veteran, was like a pilot during World War I. So he picked people either that had a family connection like Codman, or Dick Jensen, the guy that's killed, and he does the voiceover about how he hates to lose so many young men early in the movie. He was Patton's girlfriend's girlfriend from back in the teens, her son. He picked him because of that personal connection. He also picked people that other people wouldn't have, and kind of said, hey, you're willing to work, I'll put you to work, but I want you to be loyal. So I think they kind of, there's a bit of a, you might call it a toxic work environment today. I think he saw it as giving people a second chance, or doing a deep dive and pulling people that had that extra connection or that actual extra loyalty. But it's an interesting question. I don't think he was an easy guy to work for. But I think the people that worked for him loved him. So it sounds like I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth. But yeah, it's a question from the.
One more question?
Is there, I'll do as many as you want, but is there a question from the online?
We have a comment and question
Okay.
from our friend Stretch
I'll
on
get you next.
YouTube chat. First of all, you convinced me Patton was definitely more complex than I ever knew. Thank
Good.
you. Question: did Marshall refuse Patton's request to leave West Point and Army College because Patton had a poor understanding of the principles of education, as shown by his soldier slap incident?
No, it really came down to rank. So the commandant of West Point and the commandant of the War College with star ability at the time. So you could be a 2-star general to fit into that Army's organizational chart. Patton was a 4-star general, and it would be technically beneath his rank to take either one of those positions. So Marshall was basically enforcing the rules based on the rank that you were supposed to be to have that job, is what's going on there. So I think Marshall probably realized Patton would actually be pretty good at both of those jobs, but that it would create a problem and create accusations of favoritism if you either created a different rank for that position, or promoted Patton to do it, or let him do it on a different pay grade than you're in. Can I do this? one other, this gentleman has been very patient. Yeah.
I just wondered if it had been there, what your take might be on the presentation of Patton Museum.
So I went there years and years ago, and they've done a complete revision of it, and I haven't been back since they've done it. So the pictures online are gorgeous, and the folks, when I was writing this book, they were very helpful with photos and things like that, but I haven't been back, I don't know, a year. I can't really comment, but the picture looks amazing. It's kind of one of those feel-good stories as a taxpayer. Military sites and museums around our country were kind of an embarrassment for a long time. They've gone and actually fixed them and made them really nice. Military ones run by the military, actually treasures now. But I have not been to the Patton one. Sorry.
Well, I think we all have a permanent opinion.
Yep.
You know, maybe you say he'd be happy to stick around.